home front during World War I. One area or one unit which your paper 2 exam might test you on is the home front, life in Britain during World War I. World War I started in August 1914. Straight away, the government introduced the Defence of the Realm Act, which is nicknamed DORA. This gave the government a huge range of powers over people and the country. They did this because they wanted to control who was doing what in the country. So for example, they could limit pub working hours. They could dictate to some workers they had to stay in certain industries. So for example, some miners had to stay in their job. They couldn't change jobs, they couldn't go and join the war effort, they had to stay where they were. In 1914, when the war started, the British Army was quite small. There were about 250,000 men in the army, and this needed to change and increase very, very quickly if Britain was going to have any chance of being successful in World War I. A recruitment campaign was undertaken. Posters were produced to encourage men to join up, and lots of men did because they thought it was their duty, they felt patriotic, they wanted to defend their country, they wanted to go on an adventure maybe, so lots of people joined up. In fact, in the first month, over 500,000 men joined the army. They volunteered to go and fight against Germany in World War I. By 1916, there were about 2.5 million people in the army. There were a whole range of posters. In the first year of the war, 110 different posters were produced, lots of them based around recruiting people to go. Despite this huge surge of recruits, of volunteers to the army, it wasn't enough. In 1916, the government introduces conscription. Conscription was where people had to go and fight in the army. They were sent a letter and they had to go and join up and enlist to go and fight. It started off to just single men, but then was extended to married men as well because Britain needed more and more recruits. Some people didn't like the idea of conscription. For example, 50 MPs in Parliament voted against the Conscription Act of 1916. Some people refused to go to war, and they were called conscientious objectors. They were nicknamed conchies. They were treated badly by local communities who thought they were cowards, who thought they were wimps. They would have white feathers put through the letterbox. They would be ignored and shunned in the streets, and no one would talk to them. Although some MPs and some people didn't like conscription, out of 8 million people who were conscripted into the army, only 16,000 refused. Those that were refused had several options. They could sometimes go and work behind the front lines. Sometimes they could do key war work in Britain if they could prove that either religiously or morally they had a good reason not to go. If they couldn't or just refused to do it, then they could have been put in prison and faced punishments. After 1916, people were conscripted and the nature of propaganda posters tends to change. From being positive and upbeat, they become more posters in terms of making people feel guilty if they're if they haven't joined up to go and fight in the war. So recruitment and conscription is one area they might ask you about in the exam. Another area they might ask you about is food. In 1917, voluntary rationing was introduced in Britain. In 1918, it was changed to compulsory rationing, whereby things like milk and sugar were rationed so that people could make sure that the country had enough. Things had got so bad that by 1917, 1 in 4 supply ships, merchant supply ships coming to Britain, was sunk by German U-boats. At one point, Britain only had 6 weeks' worth of wheat left in the country. This led to posters and campaigns of voluntary rationing, and then the following year in 1918 to compulsory rationing. Another crisis that struck during World War One was the Munitions Crisis. Because the war was going on for such a long time, and because lots of shells and bullets were being used, Britain and the British Army were running out of supplies. In 1916, there was a munitions crisis. Sometimes the British soldiers were being told only to use 3 rounds a day. Trainee soldiers, people who had been trained before they went to the front lines, were using pretend weapons, some were even using wooden sticks because there wasn't enough equipment for them to train properly with. It was David Lloyd George who came in to solve this issue. In 1916, he used the phrase that he was going to deliver the goods. That was the phrase used to help explain what he was going to do to supply Britain with enough equipment. For example, 15 new munitions factories were built. The biggest one was in Gretna. It was 9 miles long and it employed 30,000 people. So the munitions crisis and feeding the country all comes under DORA. We've also got, as part of our look at Britain during World War One, the area to consider of propaganda. Posters were produced, like we said, films were made. Films like For the Empire were watched by over 9 million people. So lots and lots of different things were happening during World War One. There were also some attacks on Britain during World War One. German airships, called Zeppelins, would drop bombs on British towns and cities. In December 1914, some people were killed, 119 people were killed in Scarborough when German ships fired shells from the sea onto or into Scarborough. We mentioned the propaganda. We've also got the fact of censorship. Some things were covered up by the British government. For example, in 1914, a warship, HMS Audacious, was sunk with no record of it being anywhere. Nothing was said about it, no newspaper reports. It was completely covered up so as not to give away bad news. It wasn't until 1916 that reporters were allowed onto the front lines, because the British government did not want people at home finding out what was going on. Now obviously the war was going on for a long time by now. So in 1917, when Lord Beaverbrook becomes the new Minister of Information, he allows more access and more freedom of press. So more lists of casualties are produced and published, and the public find out more. Because as more and more people are returning to Britain from the war effort, they're finding out more and more about what it is that's going on. When you look at the sources in the exam paper, it's crucial you consider who has produced them and why. If it's a government report, it's likely to be reliable. If it's a speech by somebody or a poster, the purpose is likely to be key. It's going to be produced to get people to do something or to think something, and that's going to be very, very important. The other aspect of World War One is women. What did women do during the war to help out? Well, the answer is quite a lot. They were crucial in the war effort in Britain. 900,000 women went to work in munitions factories. 200,000 became secretaries to take the roles that were needed to fill once the men had gone off to war. Women were nicknamed canaries. Those that worked in munitions factories and skin turned yellow were nicknamed canaries because of the condition of their skin. At a factory in Silvertown in 1917, there was an explosion in which people were killed, but yet the next day women go back to work and they carry on with their jobs and they provide a vital service for things in World War One to help the British war effort. Lots of people did lots of different things. There's various aspects to this topic. So we've got recruitment, we've got conscription, we've got feeding the country, we've got the munitions crisis, we've got propaganda, we've got information. And the last thing to consider is, did people support the war effort or not? This is difficult to tell because you had the propaganda, which was persuading people to do the right thing, but then would they have done it anyway? So you have to weigh up what might have happened and what actually did happen. So it's really, really difficult to say. This is why, or one reason why, it's crucial that in the exam you think about the source. What does the source tell you? Does it fit with what you know? And how does it fit with what you know? The broad context, and then some specific details to support that answer. Think about the nature of the source. Is it a cartoon? What's the cartoonist saying? Is it a diary? Is it a speech? Is it a political poster? How does that affect things? We need to think about the purpose of these sources. Why has that person bothered to produce that source? And how does that affect how you're going to answer the question?